In 2012, after centuries of searching, experts finally found King Richard III's remains in a parking lot. But when they examined the body, the dark truth emerged. Richard III was born in 1452, right around the outset of the Wars of the Roses. This conflict, which saw the throne of England change hands several times over, would define Richard's entire life. He was forged in the war's bloodshed, and it turned him into an incredibly ruthless man. It provided the backdrop for his infamous rise to power and his gruesome end. There were two sides in the Wars of the Roses. First was the Red Rose of Lancaster, led by the Mad King Henry VI, and his wife, Margaret of Anjou. They fought against the White Rose of York, led by Richard's father, the Duke of York. The fighting started at the First Battle of St. Albans, when Richard III was just 2 years old. It wasn't long before the conflict started taking a toll on the boy. Richard's father, the Duke of York, didn't have a lot of time for parenting. He had a throne to fight for, so when the fighting went sideways, the Duke had to flee England, abandoning his sons, Richard and George, to Lancastrians. Just 7 years old, Richard found himself a prisoner of war, caught up in his father's squabbles for the crown. Richard and his brother George ended up in the care of the Duchess of Buckingham. The boys were comfortable, though their fate was in Lancastrian hands, and they might have been killed at any moment. Then, around a year later, they received devastating news. The Duke of York was a formidable figure and one of the most powerful men in England, but no one is truly safe while playing the Game of Thrones. The Duke's rebellion was cut violently short in 1460 at the Battle of Wakefield. Both the Duke of York and his second son, Edmund, lost their lives in the fray. The Yorkist cause crumbled, and Richard's mother sent him and his brother George to the Netherlands for fear of their lives. It seemed as though the Wars of the Roses had met their end, but while the House of York was down, it was not out. Richard would return to his home shores before long. The Duke of York was gone, but his oldest son, the soon-to-be King Edward IV of England, was ready to take up the mantle. Though just 19 years old, Edward towered over other men at 6.4 tall, and he inspired those who had supported his father to take up the fight with him. Mere months after the battle that cost the Duke of York his life, Edward returned to England, demolished a Lancastrian force, dethroned Henry VI, and named himself King Edward IV. The tables had turned, and this meant massive changes for young Richard. Richard III was born the 11th child of the Duke of York. Now he was the second brother of the King of England. That's a big difference. Edward sent young Richard to live with his greatest ally, Richard Neville, the infamous kingmaker who helped multiple men claim England's crown during the Wars of the Roses. The kingmaker was nearly as ruthless as Edward himself, and the king charged him with training Richard as a knight. This time, the kingmaker shaped the man Richard became, for more than one reason. Richard got more than just some training from his time with the kingmaker. He also met Richard Neville's beautiful daughter, Anne. They made a perfect match, but there was just one problem. The Wars of the Roses weren't over, not by a long shot. Despite their shared youth, Richard and Anne would end up on completely opposite sides of the conflict, though they'd crossed paths again before long. Richard III spent his teenage years training in the arts of war and probably sneaking glances at Anne Neville whenever he got the chance. He also developed scoliosis in these years, though no sources revealed how it happened. While Richard's curved spine certainly never held him back, it gave men like William Shakespeare fodder to turn him into a deformed monster in their stories. To be fair, Richard III's disturbing actions more than earned him his dark reputation. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker. Call him what you will, he was like a second father to Richard III. He knew Neville for longer than he knew his actual father, and Neville played a major role in his upbringing. So, we can only imagine how Richard felt when he learned of the Kingmaker's betrayal. 9 years into Edward IV's reign, Neville decided he didn't like the king he'd made. Neville turned coat and sided with Edward's greatest enemy, Margaret of Anjou. For a time it seemed like the fight between Lancaster and York was long dead and buried. Turns out it had only been sleeping. The kingmaker brought Margaret of Anjou's army to England and forced both Edward and Richard to flee the country. Neville put the mad King Henry VI back on the throne after a 9-year sabbatical, and the Yorks were forced to consider their next move. Richard and Edward reeled from Neville's betrayal, but that wasn't even the worst part. Richard lost the love of his life as well. Many in England had long assumed Richard and Anne Neville would marry before long, but as allegiances changed, old plans went out the window. In order to prove his loyalty to Margaret of Anjou, Richard Neville married his daughter off to Anjou's son, Edward of Westminster. So now, not only had Richard's surrogate father turned on him, but he lost his lady love in the process too. Yet still, the news just kept getting worse for Richard and the Yorks. It was already bad enough that the kingmaker had switched sides. Then the Yorks learned one of their own had turned on them as well. Richard wasn't the only York who had his eyes on a daughter of the kingmaker. His older brother George had married Neville's daughter, Isabel, not long before the betrayal, notably against the king's wishes. When Neville switched allegiances and deposed Edward, George betrayed his own blood and sided with his wife's family. Richard, meanwhile, stayed true to his brother. He too had the hots for one of Neville's daughters, but that wasn't enough to make him turn on his own. Either way, neither Edward nor Richard would forget George's betrayal, and he would pay the ultimate price for it in the end. Oh, George, you picked the wrong side. Mere months after Richard Neville kicked Edward IV off the throne, Edward and Richard returned to England with a vengeance. By now, Richard was 18 years old and desperate to prove himself on the field of battle. And boy, did he ever. King Henry VI's second stint on the throne didn't last long. Edward and Richard were only gone for a few months, and when they came back, they were out for blood. This was the first time that Richard III really got to show what he was made of in battle, and he was more than up to the challenge. It turns out the boy who had known nothing but strife for his entire life was pretty darn good at it. Soon enough, Richard and his brother had the Lancastrians on the ropes once again. The kingmaker had betrayed both Richard and Edward. They didn't have to wait long to get their revenge. They met Neville's forces at the Battle of Barnet, and the kingmaker didn't survive the fray. Neville had been one of the richest, most powerful men in England, but he died in the mud the same as any of his men. But that wasn't the Yorks' only victory that day. Before the Battle of Barnet, Edward sent Richard to their traitorous brother George with an offer to let bygones be bygones. Maybe George sensed defeat in the air because he readily accepted and returned to his brother's side. Though if he knew what was coming, maybe he had preferred to die on the battlefield like the kingmaker. Next up came the Battle of Tewkesbury, and I bet this one felt particularly good for our pal Richard III. Why? Well, remember how Richard had the hots for Heir Neville? He must have been devastated when she married Edward of Westminster, and he must have felt amazing when he learned that his brother's forces had slain Edward at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Richard's side had won, and the guy who took his girl was dead. Talk about a good day for Richard III. After the Battle of Tewkesbury, Richard III got to do something he'd been waiting a long time for. He finally married Heir Neville. He'd been pining after her ever since he was a boy, and the fact that she stood to inherit some of the richest lands in all of England certainly didn't hurt either. But there was just one problem with this union. Richard's brother George was completely against it. Remember, George was married to Anne's sister, and he wanted the juicy inheritance all to himself. But George never expected what Richard was prepared to do, to marry Anne. Even at just 19 years old, Richard III was undoubtedly one of England's most ruthless men, which made his offer to his brother George all the more surprising. He agreed to renounce his claims to all of the Nevilles' richest lands. He just wanted Anne, or so he said. That offer was too good to pass, and George finally consented to the marriage. It seems as though Richard truly loved Anne Neville and cared nothing for her lands. Or maybe he just knew what the future had in store for his brother George. George was worried about getting his wife's inheritance, but he should have been more worried about his own skin. As the years went by, he grew more and more estranged from his brothers. Finally, in 1478, his relationship with the king reached a breaking point. Edward had George executed for treason. Some stories claim the way he did it was absolutely brutal. They say Edward had his brother drowned in a barrel of fine English vino. In the end, Richard got the girl he wanted, and all the inheritance he could ask for, but his lady love and all the money he could ask for wasn't enough for Richard III. He needed more. When Edward IV kicked the royal bucket, his brother Richard swooped in as Lord Protector, and wasted no time tracking down his 13-year-old nephew, the new King Edward V. Under the guise of protecting the boy, Richard escorted him to London, though protection quickly turned into paranoia. Within days, Richard had Edward's maternal uncle, the Earl Rivers, and a few other unlucky associates executed for treason. Totally normal uncle behavior. Meanwhile, Edward's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, saw the writing on the wall. After hearing about her brother's execution, she scrambled to Westminster Abbey with her children, including young Richard, second in line to the throne. She may have thought the sanctuary would keep them safe, but deep down she knew exactly what kind of man her brother-in-law was. Once in London, Richard convinced his nephew the king was in danger, and shuffled him off to the Tower of London for his own safety. A bold claim considering the Tower's track record as less of a royal suite and more of a permanent vacation from life. Still, Edward was set to be crowned on June 22, 1483, and outwardly everything seemed fine. That false sense of security may be why Elizabeth made a tragic error. She handed over her other son to the Archbishop of Canterbury to join his brother at the coronation. Except, surprise, there would be no coronation. Both boys ended up imprisoned in the Tower, where they faded into legend as the princes in the Tower. Then, in a twist only a narcissist could love, Richard claimed the throne for himself. A priest stood outside Old St. Paul's and declared Edward IV's marriage illegitimate, making his sons, oh so conveniently, illegitimate too. The people swallowed the story whole, and Richard, in an Oscar-worthy performance of reluctant heroism, graciously accepted the crown. What a guy! Though no one can say for sure who must have minded the whole twisted scheme, Richard III certainly had the most to gain from it. He accepted the people's will and became King Richard III on July 6, 1483. He'd started off as the 11th child of the Duke of York. He was a prisoner of war at 7, a general at 17, and now at 30, he became one of the unlikeliest kings in the history of England. But what of his two nephews still under watch at the Tower of London? The princes in the Tower shouldn't have posed a threat to the new King Richard III. After all, the Church had declared them illegitimate. They didn't have a claim to the throne any longer. But Richard was too smart to take that for granted. You and I can easily see that his rise to the throne was suspicious. Someone might have decided to put the rightful king back on the throne. No one knows exactly what happened to them, but one thing is certain. After Richard became king, no one ever saw the princes in the Tower alive again. Richard III's power grab didn't exactly whisper peace and stability. By snatching the throne through backhanded moves and murky justifications, he basically sent an open invite to any noble with ambition and a decent army. Unsurprisingly, it didn't take long for rebellion to brew. The Duke of Buckingham, once a staunch ally, turned enemy just months into Richard's reign. His original plan? Free young Edward V from the Tower and restore him as king. But as whispers about the prince's grim fate leaked out, Plan A quickly crumbled. Undeterred, Buckingham hitched his hopes to a new horse, a young exiled noble in France with a shaky claim but serious potential. 1. Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor arrived in England with 5,000 men and a fire lit under him. Despite being outnumbered by Richard III's larger force, he marched straight into destiny at the Battle of Bosworth Field. This should have been just a footnote in Richard's reign, a routine beatdown of a minor usurper, but the battle quickly turned sideways. As Richard's forces began losing ground, he called on the Earl of Northumberland and his 4,000 men to join the fight. The response? Silence. Whether due to sabotage, miscommunication, or outright betrayal, Northumberland stayed put, and Richard found himself abandoned in the middle of a battlefield. Staring down a threat, he now had to end himself. Spotting Henry in the distance, Richard made a snap decision. No more waiting, no more hoping. If he wanted to keep the crown, he had to cut the snake off at the head with his personal bodyguard. Richard charged straight at Henry Tudor, slicing down his standard-bearer and unhorsing a legendary knight along the way. He came within just a few sword lengths of the would-be king, but Henry, untested in war but clever as hell, vanished into his men to survive. Richard's momentum stalled, and Tudor's forces rallied. Richard charged straight at Henry Tudor. Slowly but surely, they pushed Richard back into a marsh. His horse slipped, and the king hit the mud. Still, he refused to retreat. Surrounded and soaked, he shouted, "God forbid that I retreat one step. I will either win the battle as king or die as one." And die he did. Richard was finally killed by a brutal halberd strike to the head, so powerful it caved in his helmet. Word of his death broke his army spirit. Northumberland fled, and on that very battlefield, Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII. But Richard's humiliation didn't end there. His naked body was thrown over a horse and paraded through the streets of Leicester before being dumped in an unmarked grave. History would forget him for centuries, until he was finally found beneath a parking lot. Richard III was one of the few English kings whose final resting place was unknown, until 2012, when archaeologists made a remarkable discovery. Under a nondescript parking lot, they found a skeleton with some very specific traits. First of all, it had a twisted spine. Second, it had received some brutal injuries, particularly to the head. DNA testing eventually confirmed what everyone was thinking. It was Richard III. The discovery of Richard's skeleton finally confirmed what we'd long assumed. Richard's end was absolutely brutal. The examination of Richard's remains not only proved his violent end, but also revealed several likely posthumous humiliation injuries. In the end, Richard III's story didn't just close with a sword. It closed with centuries of infamy, a king buried under concrete and a legacy twisted by propaganda, betrayal, and bloodshed. Whether monster or misunderstood monarch, one thing is certain. Few fell from the throne harder than Richard III. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factor Nail, for more incredible facts about everything.